Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Rudy El-Khoury, Dean of the School of Architecture, welcoming you to our first installment in the Tecnoglass lecture series. This year's series was curated by our colleague, Shauna Meyer, who placed the emphasis this year on American practices and also highlighting issues of the profession, elevating the preoccupations of the profession to engage with the problems we face in the 21st century. So I would like to thank our sponsor, Tecnoglass, for continuing to support our series. This is, I think, the 9th year, allowing us to maintain the high standards and ambitions we are very proud of. And now let me introduce Shauna, who is going to tell you more about our speaker tonight.
All right, thank you, Rodolphe. And again, thank you to the sponsor and for all of you being here. We're very excited to get the spring semester series kicked off. And just to add a few notes about the title of the series, the Health, Safety, Welfare of Architecture. What does this mean? It means the profession defines the duty of the architect in terms of health, safety, and welfare. The demands on contemporary architectural practice are stretching these responsibilities to include critical challenges such as social inequity, environmental stewardship, and climate change impacts. The 23-24 Tecnoglass series features practices that have meaningfully impacted the built environment by energizing disciplinary dedications with persistent innovation and imagination. They work through the pragmatic demands of health, safety, and welfare and reach with an expanded material formal capacity beyond traditional boundaries to tackle the big challenges we face today. So that brings us to tonight, and I'm incredibly honored to be able to introduce Jonathan Tate, principal and founder of Office of Jonathan Tate, or OJT, as we see on the screen here. I'm sure we'll hear more about it, but as an introduction, Jonathan established his practice in New Orleans in 2011 as a creative, expansive, and exploratory practice with a desire to contribute to contemporary discourse. I'm excited for the work that he will share with you tonight that not only provides conventional project typologies through unconventional forms, but embraces the reworking of normative, overlooked, familiar, and otherwise modest. It is within these conditions OJT has preserved historical and cultural context while projecting form, space, and social values forward. Additionally, Jonathan and his team focus on extending the agency of architecture through applied research, opportunistic planning, and strategic development. Jonathan has established a critical practice that is nationally recognized and simultaneously engages the profession as well as the local community. He has been awarded nationally on many occasions for his built work. As an incredible thinker and doer, Jonathan has an additional trait contributing to his success. He is humble and willing to give his time and energy to foster the next generation of architects. So tonight, Jonathan will present his lecture, Practice as Project. The lecture engages the series proposition through a review of current projects to illustrate the role of practice, the work and its agency as a fundamental architectural project. Thank you all for attending and your attention, and please help me welcome Jonathan.
Okay, is that everybody can hear me? No problems. Well, thank you all for having me here this evening. It's an honor to be at the University of Miami to give a talk and get to know the school a little bit as a consequence. Thank you, Shauna, for the invitation to be here and your kind words earlier and the opportunity to speak in your class this morning, which was also a lot of fun. And of course, to the dean for having me and again, the university at large. Let's see. I've got a little preamble that I usually kind of walk through as a way to anchor the talk a little bit, and it actually keeps me on course, at least initially, in the way that we describe this. And this is going to be hilarious if this keeps up with me. the thing there. Maybe it's that good. The okay, so as a just again, kind of starting out here. Let's see, as a quick preface to the material I'm about to present, I will start by saying this is a representation of a series of projects, but is an effort to express a real interest in how our practice is if not the project. First, a bit of background on the office. I started OJT in 2011 after nearly 15 years with one practice, another small practice. Equally, if not more pertinent, when it began was an ongoing formative experience of living in New Orleans after Katrina. We talked a lot about this morning. Teaching mostly while practicing some and simultaneously living through the Great Recession. Also important thing. For me anyways. That experience initiated a desire to generate a platform that could engage in the things that were happening around us at that time. Not any one project, but the thing that could enable this dialogue, the practice, the office and its agency. So for us, what practice has meant is a vehicle for exploring topics and concerns through our commission work, what we all do as architects, and more assertively through exploratory endeavors. What we invest ourselves in is a measure of what we care about and what we think we have an impact on or can have an impact on, a continuum of thematic and contextual interest. It reflects the way you see the world, and every project becomes, through its invention, another way of reflecting that view. Let's see, I'll attempt to illustrate this range in the forthcoming projects. What I'm showing today is a mixture of propositions and realized work. As the slide above suggests, they each feed off of one another. This is actually quite old, but I think a helpful diagram that we put together as a way just to describe, like, here's a series of projects, here's a series of investigations. These are the scales that we're working at, and what they, you know, whether it was the design, and I use the word investigations a lot instead of research for different reasons. But we work on a broad range of project types, and though we work on a broad range of project types, we're probably best described through a couple topical concerns, one programmatic and the other geographic. And the first of those topical concerns, I'll say, is housing. And with this, and as I get through sort of scrolling through these slides, and I have a lot of slides and I'll try to move fast and just kind of talk through the number of projects. It's a certain kind of housing that I'm talking about now, and it is small scale housing. This is infill work, mostly single family, a lot of it. We do all kinds of housing, so multifamily, private commission housing, you know, whatever, the sort of full spectrum of housing. But the arena that I think we've been most imaginative in is the smaller house. As I was looking at this, I thought maybe instead of calling it housing, I could call it units. You'll see there's a lot of discussion around the unit or housing as a unit. Anyways, starting out, this is a current project, or to begin, I should say, a current project that we're working on at the moment and kind of wrapping up is a project in Memphis, Tennessee that we call the Form Book. And when I talk about different ways that we work on housing, not everything we do is about creating a design for a home necessarily or the construction of a home, but it's often about how you implement an idea around how housing can be generated. And so in this case, we were invited by a CDC or Neighborhood Development Corporation in Memphis, Tennessee that has within their purview the district around the hospitals in Memphis, kind of just outside the kind of urban ring, if you will. And what they were trying to do was develop this is their footprint. What they were trying to do was actually develop something that they could talk to interested parties, let's say homeowners, lot owners, small scale developers, about what housing could be in this particular district, and what they were trying to kind of support and facilitate in terms of generating more housing, but also like what the neighborhood and the texture of their district, let's say, would become. So they asked us to look at their district, and so these are some slides of what it looks like. Essentially, it's, you know, your kind of typical bungalow, single family stuff. A little rundown in places, but really, you know, what we were kind of captivated by the fabric. And by the way, I lived in Memphis for a long time, so this was like a home for me too. So, but being in New Orleans and then coming back, And so anyway, we put together this book. So this was our design, if you will. And what the book was intended to do was actually describe to somebody in fairly rudimentary terms what it meant to develop property. And so this was a series of, or these will be pages through the book itself, where we talk about, what a use is, what a setback is, what parking means. And so we're trying to convey kind of graphically to someone who may not understand what development means, what development is. And so we get into things around financial basics. What does development mean? What are you trying to gain from it? Instead of making housing, you're also trying to make money, I think is what it says somewhere in there. What does housing mean in this context? Ones and twos and ones and ones and so forth. Like, what are the different configurations when we think of housing? What are the different possibilities? And then there's a kind of whole series of like, what are the right ways to think about housing in this area, where we talk about right sizing. If a typical house is 1,600 square feet, we were saying you could make it smaller, more efficient, and therefore, have the environmental and economic benefits of that. Thinking of housing as being universal, like it could fit on any number of lots in the neighborhood. Thinking about development as not static. You don't just build one thing. There are opportunities to unlock other potentials on a site. And so think about that as part of your initial development. And then when it came to design, it was like, what were the possibilities around design, and what were the things that you could do that were economical and that were, that then tied back into the context of the neighborhood. So this is where we went back to the photos and started, coming up with cheeky names about the different front porches that we saw as a way of kind of thinking through, what that could be. Little diagrams like this about the front's interesting and the back is boring, and the content there and the reason for that, I'll get into in the next few projects, but the idea being that you could make that the house itself ought to be fairly simple and straightforward, and that the embellishments, if you will, could be kind of contained in the sort of layer of between the public and the unit itself, so the porch in this case. Anyway, so with that, we did a few case studies, and then we offered these options for housing. So it's like, here's one version of a single family. Here's a version of a single family with an ADU. Here's a two family. Here's a fourplex. And then this is a multifamily. These projects actually were really interesting for us because, again, we didn't have a client other than a CDC. We were working with them to try to sort of move design forward. It has turned into, I think we've got 20 plus houses that have been generated out of this one book, where they try to make introductions to us, they come to us, we then help them kind of move the process along. So it's been, as a sort of if you will, an advocacy tool, it's been really effective. And they found great success with it. That rolls into another project. I'm going to kind of flip through these sequentially here, and they all kind of feed off of one another naturally. But another one that sort of fits in this realm that's also about ideas is a good illustration of what I think of whenever we're thinking often about single family housing. And as we were talking about this morning in the class, it's like we focus on if you will, the kind of non-conventional architectural housing, in that we're looking at things that are speculative, that are quote unquote production housing. These are the things that you make thousands and thousands of to meet the demands of housing in our country. And if you know the stats around housing, I think the greatest percentage, I used to know the actual percentage is of housing that gets built in our country over the course of a year is single family housing. And so we have kind of systematically, as architects, removed ourselves for different reasons from that realm. And a lot of what we're doing is sort of with our work is like, how do we reinsert ourselves? I'll get more into that later, but part of it is like an attitude around what a single family house is. And this is where we were kind of, if you will, if you're reading any of this, we articulated it as a unit. So a house as a unit, in the same way you think of multifamily housing, a house, or as a unit, a dwelling unit within a multifamily development. And so if you've got kind of a fixed entity, the unit itself, what are the things you can do here again to embellish that and to create kind of opportunities within context? And so this was actually for a competition in Chicago that we were invited to come up with a proposal for an approach to single family housing. This was our approach. We didn't win the competition, but this is what we were looking at in terms of like a way to do this. And not unlike the NMDC work, the goal with the city who sponsored this and the planning department was that they would provide access to individuals that were interested in development with these kind of case studies or well, let's say case studies that they could then use to sort of move into development in general, but they were to provide kind of examples and opportunities. Those are individual units of housing, which leads me to another project that, and you can see, I'm going to kind of start running through these. Another project that we've worked on for a number of years now, also with a nonprofit, that was about actually developing a larger neighborhood around single-family housing, or in this case, two-family housing. The project is called Bastion. It's for a nonprofit organization that that was developing a housing community, or a community that was based around a community healthcare model. They are specifically catered to post 9/11 veterans that are coming back from combat and service with long-term disabilities, essentially. So they're trying to create a community that sort of fomented a kind of a care and wellness, a sort of spirit, if you will, but a real sort of connection with the residents and how they could help one another. The development was on 5.5 acres. I'll show you in the northern part of New Orleans, close to the lake. If you're familiar with New Orleans, it's about 2 miles or so away from the French Quarter, the kind of center, historic center, not kind of the historic center of New Orleans. We started with a large site that was vacant. It's the context here is not what you think of in New Orleans. This is like 1950s single-family ranch houses. Essentially, this is all post-war developed neighborhoods, a lot of slab on grade. This was an area that after the storm was flooded, essentially. This is the area of one of the canal breaches. Our site there outlined on the left was pre-Katrina. During the storm, you can see it's covered in water, and then after the storm, it was basically scraped clean. And so that's why it was vacant. There was actually quite a number of kind of low-scale multifamily housing on site that they removed, and the Corps used this site as a staging area for the repair of the flood wall. So we were approached by Bastion and asked to conceptualize spatially, architecturally, an environment that, as I said, addressed their wellness needs, but at the same time, like one that was meant to stitch into the adjoining community. There were a series of like, here, what are we trying to do on the site itself? But there was also like an overall approach of like, how do we get, what in effect is this density that we relate to multifamily housing and do it given the context and given some of the funding mechanisms at the scale of a single or two family house. And so we had this kind of density issue that we were working with, and at the same time, trying to generate this community that very much was impacted by and informed by the spatial construct of the site. So this was a series of diagrams that we've done that kind of showed the way we organized everything. Again, it was a vacant site of buildings, but there were these beautiful old oak trees. So the oaks all survived the storm. They had been, 50, 75-year-old oak trees, very mature. But everything else was gone essentially. And so as we started sort of piecing it together, another motive was to try to save as many of those trees as we could. This project, for what it's worth, began in around 2014. We're still working on it. The image that you see here, that area there, is the phase that we're working on now. In fact, this is what we refer to as phase 3. The rest of this is all constructed, as you'll see, but this is phase 3, which is now limited. Actually, it's a smaller site that we're about to go to bid on there. And then this is a whole nother site. This is all the housing that I'll go over. Just while we're at it, this new area, or this area here, will be their offices. They've actually grown, and the services that they provide, not just to their community, they're now trying to reach out to the city at large. And so they need facilities for that. And then instead of affordable housing, which all of this is, this last section will be transitional housing, where they focus on mothers with children that are homeless, essentially. So it's a kind of transitional homeless housing that we'll be working on next on this site. So it's evolved over the years. It's actually been an incredible project, an incredible organization. This is it as it is today, essentially. It's around, let's say, 60 units of housing on site right now. You can see the context of the neighborhood. All the vacant lots that you're seeing in the foreground here are a consequence of the breach whenever the flood wall failed. You can see the canal, the London Canal to the right there, kind of going towards downtown, and give you a sense of the proximity. This is the site, as I talked about, was kind of organized around, using the housing, well, I hadn't talked about, but using the housing as the sort of ring around this deeper lot in order to create a larger green, which was their communal space. You can see it here at grade level. And get a sense of the oaks there and then the housing. But the main component here is looking at, how we were composing and creating kind of an creating an economical model of kind of duplex residential here. And what we ended up doing was actually just looking at, we had two different house types essentially, and just through the manipulation of those two different house types to try to create some kind of spatial, complexity on the site itself, but also we're able to kind of move around and shift them in order to weave around the trees, but importantly to create the space that you're seeing now from above, but this center courtyard. So the idea of the duplex was actually driven by the requirements of the funding, in this case, low-income housing tax credits, but they're through studies with constituents that were candidates to live on site. There was a discussion around what was the right structure, communal structure for someone living here where they felt like they weren't alone, so they didn't live by themselves and no one really knew who they were, through sort of a lack of proximity around other doorways, and then the idea that there might be so there was sort of autonomy through, a single family house that you just walk in and out of. And then the other criteria they're worried about is that if there were too many people that all had to sort of congregate and circulate around one another, that there was also a sort of, you wouldn't get to know anyone. It was just too easy to kind of ignore people. And so the magic number for everyone, this came back over and over again, was 4. Like they wanted a, a fourplex essentially. And so the way these are configured is, and what felt ingenious at the time was like turning them in on one another. So you essentially have two unit buildings that face each other, create, a fourplex with these stoops and entryways. So and they're all different. They're colored different. They interact differently. They shift back and forth. Again, sometimes there's a tree in the middle of it. Sometimes they're green and they have a bollard. And then sometimes, again, you've got trees that are kind of that you can see that we've weaved around in this case. And the building, to go back to the buildings themselves. So there was using the housing as a way to form space, both at a perimeter, but also internally, the connection I'm talking about now with the courtyards. There was also a desire for us to kind of manipulate form in this case, so that as a house, you weren't entirely sure about its scale. You weren't entirely clear about entry and exit. You can see there are no front doors along the street, so that was intentional. So no one had access, say, to the street primarily, or to this rear space primarily. Everyone had the same kind of uniform exposure to the inside, but your front door was actually a pathway that came off the street, if you will, into the court space, or you all had similar access to the rear, into the rear garden space. And so again, that was also very important to us and very important to the client, how these units behaved and then how that was reflected architecturally. The shape itself was, again, our manipulating form in this case to try to create, what we felt like was kind of an abstraction on house form. But the proportions are strange and the ratio of the roofs are a little extreme. And then in some of that, and even that window is a little outsized, and we were trying to disguise other conditions that are familiar or that are more present in our city now based on what the 1950s development, and that is like the elevation of the home. So we tried to, through the shape and through the location of the window and so forth, mask this kind of elevated condition that we had to work with. But behind that facade was actually, we were relying on, some basic economics of housing development or construction, where you've got simple stick frame and then using an engineered truss in this case, which allowed us to kind of create the box or the unit, if you will, simple enough form. But through this truss, we were able to internally to create all of this kind of spatial diversity. Each of these units are different on the inside, as it turns out. So as you come in, the volume of the space, which we use that big roof section that you saw to kind of carve away, and instead of a shoebox that you might typically see for something like this, we had these large cathedral ceilings and these kind of zigzags that you can see in that number 3 slide. As you came into the unit. So there was much more going on whenever we sort of saved that for the tenant, right? So the exuberance is on the interior, and they also had attic spaces, so everyone had storage in this case. But that simple section, and again, the diversity on the interior, but it's also the site conditions that we were working with, going back to that for a second, where we were able to kind of move around and manipulate the forms so that you got a rich exterior environment in this case, of how they kind of move back and forth to address the edges of the site. And in this case, the kind of long run. And then the blank site that you see to the right is the phase that we're working on now. Okay, so with that, kind of transitioning into another project, that the previous ones that I've shown are all essentially client projects where someone has come to us and asked us to do the work. As we traditionally do as architects. This series of projects is something that around the same time we were starting Dash and started working on called the starter home, which I'll kind of get into. It was an initial idea that we had along with a partner, a guy named Chuck Rutledge, a thought partner, but also someone who was versed and skilled in development, which was helpful in this case. But it was our kind of discussions around the need for a certain kind of housing in our community that turned into more than just a discussion. It sort of splintered into a number of different areas. But the discussion was, it turned into this agenda that you're seeing here. This is something that took about 8 years to write, although it's not that eloquent, but it's sort of to the point. But it was an initial set of ideas that actually turned into this series of projects, which I'll get into. But it was initially sort of driven by observations that we were making, again, internally as a practice in the work that we were doing, the people that we were talking to, but importantly, like we were all sort of living through the post-recession boom that happened in our community, like in other communities where housing got really expensive really fast, and the place that we really loved and wanted to live became a challenging place to afford to live, right? And so what could we do as architects, in this case, thinkers, if you will, to address that? But some of the deficiencies that, we were seeing were that we were afraid that, we weren't making opportunities out of what felt like deficiencies. And so we talk a lot about holes in the city. And so this is, you might say that's vacancy, but also, cracks in the market. And that was just meant to say the challenges that we saw with the market itself. But we were specifically focused on home ownership and how we could bring people into the fold. Like this is, definitely how we build wealth in our country. And so how did you provide access to that? And, this slide talking about the power of your home's equity, right? But in working in housing and working in development, you see how decisions are made and how, through these particular decisions by the people that be, in this case, developers and the real estate industry, it was driving a market that we didn't find interesting at all. And we understood, that it could be improved upon, or at least there was some elements of it that we thought we could improve upon. But as development goes, we understand it's risky. There was a lot of sort of hesitation around investing in this portion of what it is to make a building for these reasons. We typically don't, we have our own risks that we accept, I understand, but like from a monetary risky business, that's not really right. But with housing, especially the kind of housing we're interested in, it's a pretty simple equation, if you will, right? It's not challenging in a lot of ways to sort of come up with how you could approach it and how you might be able to, push back on it some, which was our hope. And along with the kind of development concerns and the real estate concerns and all those other things, as you've seen and as you'll hear me say, it's like we have a great affinity for American housing, right? The traditional single-family home, and the fact that there's kind of a lineage of working in housing and innovation in housing attributed to architects and architecture in general, and how, you know, as I said earlier, it's like we had as a profession kind of backed out of that in some ways, which I'm happy to elaborate on if someone wants to challenge me. But like there are also great examples over the years, and we saw it as an opportunity to kind of refocus on something. As we started looking at this and as we started working through the agenda itself, it's like, well, what is it and what are we really leveraging? And this gets back to what are land opportunities. And so this felt to us like the perfect sort of cohesion around an understanding around space and spatialization of you know, architecture and buildings in particular environments. And what we saw, you know, were possibilities that, let's say, if you're not inclined, you don't really see the opportunities. And so land obviously had something to do with that. And we started looking around not just our own city, but other cities, and trying to sort of point out what we thought were possibilities for development that just weren't being taken advantage of. And so this was, in a lot of ways, just an intellectual discussion that we were having internally. We were thinking through what that might mean. We were doing a lot of work around, well, what are starter home? What does that mean exactly? Like, let's research it. It was very academic in many ways, which is a component of the office that we try to maintain when we can. Simultaneously, we started going, okay, well, what if we were to implement this? And so through this discussion, we started another investigation of like, okay, what are the actual opportunities in our own city? This is New Orleans that you're looking at. This is the French Quarter here, Mississippi River moving through there. And then Lake Pontchartrain to the top. So we did an analysis of like, okay, where's vacant land in our city? You know, what are, you know, some of the metrics around that vacancy? Is it close to downtown? Is it far away from downtown? What are the zoning regulations around it? What neighborhood is it associated with? You know, there's some economic analysis that we were doing too for median incomes in different neighborhoods, you know, a whole series of just studies and how we can analyze that. But part of this filtering and us looking for land, we recognized that there was an abundance, or we thought an abundance, of these smaller properties, right? So these were what we ultimately called odd lots in our case, reference to Di Maria, where they were properties that were referred to as non-conforming. They were smaller than a standard lot, which for us is 30 feet wide by roughly 120 feet long, or 90 to 120 feet long. And they were interesting. We were like, wow, here's some stuff that we might be able to do something with. And again, this is the sort of marrying of, you know, people that are interested in making form and shape, and then having to conform to some irregularities just seemed like a natural fit. Like, here, these look like places for us to try to engage. They were all kinds of craziness. They were, you know, as you can see up here, they may have been an abandoned alley. It was, you know, right-of-ways that left little pieces of land, triangular sites. You know, New Orleans is sort of benefits from this kind of chaotic grid, but because of the radial nature of the river and the way it was laid out, you get a lot of abnormalities in the block structure. And so that sort of drove a lot of this as well. We looked around the city, you know, where are concentrations of these? If we're going to do it, we'd like to do multiples. So where do we find clusters? And so this was like a look at different clusters. Eventually, we landed in one neighborhood, the Irish Channel, and found all of these little lots. And again, this is happening internally. This is our office driving this. We've got people that we're working with, but there's no client, let's say. And what we ended up looking in this one particular neighborhood, it's developed in the 1850s, so one of the historic neighborhoods adjacent the river, really close to the downtown area. There were roughly 28 lots in this neighborhood. We went out and systematically tried to buy all 28 lots, basically, was the idea. We didn't have money to buy the 28 lots. In fact, I don't think we had money to buy one lot, really, but we were doing what we could to try to acquire them. Which I'll sort of get into this out of place slide a little bit, but what we ended up with in that particular neighborhood is that we were able to buy one lot from a developer, who tend to be the easiest people to work with when it comes to, or the most rational people to work with, let's say, whenever it comes to property and selling something. And with that one lot, we designed one home, and we built one home, and then we put it on the market. This was around 2015, 2016, when it was finished construction. It then sat on the market for a year, basically. And so this was, a really hot market, a fringe neighborhood, but was really booming. The Irish Channel is where I lived at the time. We were seeing property values double and triple over, 1 or 2 or 3 years. At the time when we were selling this home, the average home cost in the neighborhood was around $600,000. It's, there are multiple $1 million listings in the neighborhood now. It's just had really sort of blown up. And this house we were selling for around $300,000. So let's say half the cost of what a typical home would cost in the neighborhood. This sort of market that we thought was enormous, and there's got to be tons of people looking for this thing. We just know there are because no one's trying to address it. Well, as I said, it sat there for a year. And then eventually we sold it. So that was number one. But through that, or as that was happening, we were being introduced to a number of other people. And so this started to spread. There was a lot of interest around it. And then we, as a concept, I think it started to get traction around the idea that there was land and there was these little lots were actually opportunities for people to construct things. So you had developers that started getting really interested. But then we also had other odd things happen where we were introduced to a person who at the time was homeless and had purchased one of these tiny lots and asked us to design a self-built house, which was at the time the smallest permitted structure in the city of New Orleans. And he spent 2 years constructing it. He lived on site and he built it. And what I affectionately say might be the ugliest house in New Orleans. But it was actually a really important project for us. And the client is a huge advocate now for housing, tiny housing in particular, but housing in general. And it has been actually a great relationship, which deserves its own talk. Another project that we worked on that came out of or was sort of driven by that initial development was we had another client that came to us and said, hey, look, we want to buy one of these lots and we want to just pay you all to do what you do, essentially. And so it may seem subtle, but it was pivotal for us where we had clients that were coming to us basically sponsoring our own kind of research and development work. Because they believed in it and they wanted, they were interested in doing the same thing and they wanted us to sort of, help them push it along. And so this was a project for a private client. It was also the first true starter home for us because it's a 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath house, right? It was your kind of normal house, but in this case, it was right at 1,400 square feet, 3 stories, the terracing and the window and the roof are all sort of ways to disguise the actual scale of it. And then another project, which I'll go into detail in a second, was one where we then came back and self-developed, and it was the 12 units that you're seeing there. Again, I want to talk about in more detail in a second. And then finally, the last in the sequence of projects, so the 17 houses, was another project that we also developed. And with each of these, there was a desire to kind of come up with or take advantage of, if we're going to do this, like what are we poking at? What are we putting pressure on? What are we challenging? What are we critiquing in our own action? The housing delivery system. What part of the housing delivery system were we critiquing as we develop these? And one thing that we got really interested in was the investor model and development in general, and like who benefits from that, like who has access to it, is it and what propels development and basically. And what we started with on this one and what became the first of a kind or of its kind was equity crowdfunding. So this project, we used crowdfunding to raise money for basically for the development loan or the construction loan. And those investors, all 38 of them were investors. So they didn't, unlike your traditional crowdfunding platforms, this was sort of a new thing and they actually saw a return on their investment. So at the end of this, they saw, if the profit that came off of this project, they shared in essentially, and which is a really interesting model. I don't think it's completely cooked. Even now, there's a lot of complexities around it. It's gotten more popular, of course, but what was interesting to us is that we saw it as a way, and I think the platform sees it as a way for a local community to benefit from development in their community. So we had investors that were literally across the street from this that put money into it to see the housing develop. But we had people that were living in Baltimore and everywhere else. So there was a chance for a lot of people to feel like they were participating in something with these two projects. So anyway, going back to the St. Thomas development, this is one that we also did as a team, our office, along with our partner, Chuck, that I mentioned earlier, our thought partner, and then a third partner who was a general contractor. So it was a vacant lot mostly, but also had a warehouse on one side of it. It was around, what was it, 12,800 square feet of land, which if you looked at the zoning ordinance in our case, which is as it's split up, it's a dwelling unit per land area analysis. It gave us, or we had the right to build 12 houses on the site. But if you looked at the subdivision regulations, it essentially told you that you could subdivide it into 3 sellable lots, right? So there was this sort of tension between the density that we were looking for. You know, a lot of this is how do we increase density in our cities, of course, sort of pushing back against what our land use regulations were telling us, which, you know, basically were advocating for less density. And so we sort of found a way to leverage both the what zoning was permitting, but at the same time, like provide opportunities for sales. So the equity building, these aren't rental, through the condominium regime. And so the standard legal document that you're going to see for any condominiums, but what we were able to do here, and at the time, this was also a first, is that we sort of scripted it so that instead of buying the inside of a unit, you were buying a whole house through the condo, basically. And so this is us as architects that are in there messing with legal language and like creating documents that supported the way that we saw this development should work, which was, you know, a learning curve for us for sure. But anyway, so some of the preliminary kind of design diagrams that I'm showing here, the project, again, 12 units of housing. It normally you don't have to provide parking in our historic neighborhoods. This is also in a historic district. But in the case of multifamily, which this is considered, you have to provide parking. So I'd often say that this whole design of this project is effectively around trying to fit a parking lot inside in the back of the or on the lot itself. So these are the units. They're let's say they're basically 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath units. So your standard home, they average around 1,300 square feet, so smaller than the standard home in New Orleans, and they're all about 3 stories tall. Most are 3 stories tall. This was a massing model, and then this is the project itself. You can see in terms of what it was, you can see that was the first house that we did. So that little sliver lot, which when I should have said that lot, it was sort of the prototypical small lot for us. It was 16 feet wide by 55 feet deep. This was, again, much larger, but we created, you know, through our condominium regime, all these sort of subdivisions and smaller lots, if you will, on site. But this is also the context that we were working in. So it's this kind of transition between, to the right in this image, you've got the river, and that's where you see these industrial buildings or storage kind of metal frame buildings. But then to the left, you can start to see the texture of the historic neighborhood. So we were right in between that zone and trying to transition between the two of those. And this is the development as you kind of move down the street. On the left side, there was the first house that we did, the small one. As I mentioned, this has, it was originally a warehouse. We renovated the warehouse and put 3 units in it. So we didn't tear it down. A lot of people thought we were going to tear it down. We hung on to it, but we kept the silhouette of the existing warehouse, but clad it in this perforated screen. That opening, even it was shifted, but there was originally a garage opening, and then the windows are all new, of course. And then as you kind of move down the street, you can see the rhythm and the pattern of the units themselves. And there's air between each of these because they're all technically detached housing, right? So nothing touches. There's 3 feet, minimally 3 feet apart from one another. So these are all single family residences, and that detached single family residence in this case. And everyone has a front door, with the exception of the units that are in the rear of the property. Everyone has a front door and a front porch, or a front porch and front door you can't see, which is a motif, as you'll see in our work. And then the back, there's the parking that I mentioned, which is yes, it's a requirement, but it became the kind of central space for the complex itself. This is the parking area, yes, but it's also our courtyard. It's where the kids play, the dogs go, you know, all the other stuff. These are early photographs. This is all kind of grown over now with vegetation, but you know, in this, and as we're working on the project, I often say it's like what we're trying to do is sort of embrace our context and how do we sort of pull it in and make it a part of the project itself. And so with this warehouse wall becomes the kind of backdrop for this planting area and then the units themselves. And as I said, everyone has a front porch. So this is the stoop and then into the unit. You know, proximity here is important. The idea that you kind of look across to one another and you feel the density when you're in the houses themselves. We didn't try to avoid windows lining up, although most of them don't, but it's just a condition that we're familiar with in the city. And we, you know, embrace that as part of this development. But we're also, you know, embracing the housing that's around us and how are we sort of drawing that into the building itself. Then as we're moving through this, some other newer work as well, where we're thinking about hidden densities in this case, and how do we create more on smaller lots. Another organization, so moving away from the starter home work for a second, we did the 17 and we sort of said that's it for us on that front. It spawned some other developments and some other things in other cities, but us personally, we're not really focused on it as much. We've got other things that we've run off to, but the one project that we recently completed that was something that came around a few years ago was for an organization called First 72. And they are, as it says here, a reentry housing program for formerly incarcerated individuals. And so they provide essentially transitional housing to people that are leaving long-term incarceration from the state penitentiary in Louisiana. They also provide services. So part of what they do is provide housing, but they also provide the kind of, you know, what someone needs. The 72 is an important number. The first 72 hours is they try to get everything in place for somebody as they're leaving. So they create the community, they provide the services, they make sure you have your driver's license and a cell phone and all the things to kind of help you move along. But it's sort of important that that's embedded in the housing itself. So the idea that the services and where you live are all integrated was a key component of this as a model. When we first met them, back up for a second, they had, I think, 6 beds. And what they were trying to do is create a prototype for this housing that they could then sort of deploy around the city. The idea was they didn't want to concentrate. They didn't want 100-unit development in one place. They actually wanted to make this more like neighborhood insertions where you had people moving back and becoming part of a community and not just, you know, isolating everyone and then expecting them to reintegrate essentially. So, but with that was the idea of like, okay, in a conventional housing scheme, you've got a couple of units. Now, how do we pretend that this is really more like an 8-unit development, but under the guise of a 2-family house, which is the kind of limits of our zoning in a lot of these neighborhoods. And so this was a, you know, analysis of where we might be able to locate these throughout the city and as a way to kind of quantify what the number of units are. Part of what we were doing was designing a house for them or this prototype, but also strategizing around how they deployed this throughout the city. So there was like a 2-part problem here. They had a site that the first one was going to go on. This was a diagram showing how we could actually phase the existing site out. The building to the right, and then the two smaller buildings were actually their compound. So this was where the 6 beds were. This is where their offices were, and this was vacant that you see there. And that was our proposal essentially. So these are just some quick studies around program and how we could lay it out on the site. These are all massing studies. It's funny, like the morphology of this project, I always look at it and kind of laugh because it started out with the idea that we would use containers, and they were really into containers and they wanted shipping containers, right? Which seemed paradoxical to me that you would use a container for someone who had just been incarcerated, but it was this like economy argument that they were making. They thought they could do it for cheaper. At some point along the way, they decided that the containers didn't work, thankfully, and we had to quickly shift into, okay, what does it look like if it was just stick framed? And it coincidentally held a lot of the form that was there already. And so this is the final project. We finished this, I don't know, it's been 6, 8, maybe a year ago that it was completed. This is it in its site. What you can see in the background, unfortunately, is the county prison, actually. So it's in the shadows of a large penitentiary. And then to the right in this image is another jail, actually. So it's sort of surrounded by the kind of people that, or by the people that may eventually find themselves here. And then you see their headquarters there with the First 72 sign. And then the split in this case, the sort of two-family dynamic where we were trying to create two units that felt like one unit but behaved like 8 units. There was this split between the center that we used and kind of amped up where we, as I don't think we planned this, but the house that you're seeing in the distance is not part of our unit. It's actually a window in an adjacent home. But the form of this, if I, don't typically talk about a lot, but what I will say is that a lot of the kind of the motif, if you will, of these angular roof forms and intentionally kind of residential and aesthetic is our way of embracing context as well. You can see these, that's what we're surrounded by, right? And so how do we sort of morph what we're working on, but still, stay in keeping with what we have around us. And I should check how much time. I'm good time wise. Okay. I'm only a quarter of the way through. Is that all right? I'm teasing. So kind of moving from that project into another one that talks about densities and aggregation, but how you might be able to conceive of those over time and in deference to what the limitations were from sort of regulatory perspective. And this was a project that we started several years ago with a client that said, hey, I bought this funny lot. You can see at the very end, the zero part of it is this triangular, very small lot. I want to put a container on it. Here we are again. So we put a container on it. But then we started talking about like, okay, well, over time, is there a way to actually create 3 units of housing? And this is, again, not anything spectacular in terms of, we're solving any kind of housing problems, but it was a 2-family zone district that we were subversively finding a way to sneak in another unit. And this happened, accretively. So we basically put the container down and eventually sort of built these other components around it. This is plans. These are the elevations. It's right next to a rail line. So if you want to talk context, I think the boxcars or the shipping container felt appropriate in this case. The rails and the distance. This is the completed project. And I show this for 2 reasons. One, it's like, the idea that, through housing proposition here, we're looking at ways that we can sort of sneak in and find opportunities to create more on what you may not at least initially think, but also like the project because I think embodies a desire on our part to create things that aren't precious in a way, right? Like it's a very scrappy project, I guess is a way of saying it, and it has a ruggedness to it that. Even though these are, what you might say modernist forms or contemporary modernist forms, it's like it's rusticated, it's crude in the way that it's constructed. It's cheap in a lot of ways, but we hope there's a kind of elegance to it, or we imagine there's an elegance about it through kind of proportions and the way the forms are made. In that we sort of accept the kind of normalities around, what stick framing is and so forth. And so you can't really see it. Our photographer did a good job, but like this is all spray foam insulation up there, right? But this incredible sort of like little court space that has this stair that kind of cuts through it, is open to the air. And then this is the unit. These are really small units essentially, but one the owner lives in, the other 2 that they rent out, and then kind of overlooking the rail line there to the right. And then the last in this series of housing is a project that we're sort of working through now that it ties back to a lot of what we were doing with the starter home in terms of trying to advocate for different ways to think about land use and land development and how that might have if you could adopt some approach, it might have a larger impact on the demand and the need for housing in our city and in other cities. And what has come up of late and that we were participants in was the rewriting of zoning is basically a text amendment, but it's a rewriting of the zoning ordinance that allows basically 4 units on a single family lot. And so a lot of cities are doing this. You hear Minneapolis, you hear Seattle. New Orleans has, I think, progressively, in the case of a southern city, taken this on and adopted it. And and we were, again, this is the actual language. What we were doing was looking at it like, okay, this is fantastic. Now, what does that mean exactly? And so this is our kind of initial foray into a series of like investigations around what are ways in order to build on these lots. And then the issue here, though, is like there's a lot of, anyway, saying that you can build a 4-unit house is actually quite complex. I've used enough jargon tonight. I'm not going to get into the weeds about this, but it's actually sort of impossible in some ways under the kind of normal cost of development and regulations around doing something more than a 1 or 2 family house. And it has to do with code. It has to do with providing sprinklers that sort of blow up a budget and everything else. And so what we started looking at was like, okay, well, what are ways that you might be able to implement this that, again, embraced, let's say, a taxonomy of housing and a way of like creating, back to the first project, like just sort of a dumb unit, and using that simplicity of the housing unit itself and the potentials around variation in that in the program, but also in the way that it sat on the site as a way to create architecture. So this is us like not really caring about the building so much as caring about the space that it makes and the opportunities around that. And the idea that, you know, you had 4 basically, you know, barely touching single family residences that are on a site created courts, it created private space, and it created kind of a you know, hierarchical realm, let's say, around access, but also what was property ownership, what wasn't. And so we were really like interested in what this might mean, but we were also interested in like, well, you know, how many variations you can come up with, you know. And so this is a series of like, here's different program types and how they might fit on a typical lot. These are the spatial consequences. You know, this is the sort of Noli diagram of that, but then these are the forms, right? This is the sort of architecture, and the excitement and the interest here wasn't in making a spectacular building, but how the kind of simplicity of these things all tied together in certain ways created a dynamic that you might not otherwise find in these areas, disguise to some extent the 4-unit, but also make possible the 4-unit development. Okay, so the second quicker part of this is the other part of the work that I wanted to talk about, which was around a total different topic in a lot of ways, and this is towns. It's usually how much, we're at 6:30 now, or 5:30 now, 6:30 now, 7:30 now. So I'm going to kind of run through a couple of these, but I'm not going to go through the whole thing. It's probably better just to avoid that. So anyways, towns is another thing. So if we said we had another project, here it is. It's like we've now like moved from looking at the starter home project into, as an office, investigating ideas around town and what this means to us, how we define it. The diagram sort of shows us somewhere between rural and suburban. You know, these are clusters of communities that, you know, there are thousands of them in our country, and they feel like, for us, architectural opportunities, and which involve things like economic development and, you know, adaptive reuse and ways of reimagining spaces that I think people are interested in and want to live in. But it was also kind of or it continues to be sort of a larger discussion around environmental change and the notion that, you know, we're all in coastal environments, you guys, us. It's like, as you see population migration, these become like opportunity or thinking, you know, hopefully well in the future, but maybe closer to now than we want. Where can people go and how do we distribute people around the country? And we just started thinking, well, this is how you do it. This was driven for a couple of reasons. I'm going to flip through this quickly. When I first moved to New Orleans, one of the projects that we started working on was an investigation of southeastern Louisiana. This was actually driven initially by an invitation to work with the United Home Nation, which was the largest a non-federally recognized Native American group in Louisiana. Their region was southeastern Louisiana, just south of New Orleans, and they were wiped out in Katrina. And so, you know, we started meeting with them as a way to sort of come up with a new, and they lived here historically and continue to live here, and you can see what living here looks like for them in terms of anticipation of storm events. what we worked with them on was a series of, it was basically a strategic plan, help them develop an idea around how they could live here now, how they could, which was the sort of dealing with the stresses around storm and weather events, and what are ways that they could continue to live in their region, but then what were things that they could do as the water began to rise and the land began to erode. And then ultimately, like, what did it mean to relocate if you looked, 50 years in the future, what the potentials are in terms of where land would remain, right? And so you can see most of their area gets wiped out under, I think this is the 3-foot or 1.5 meter sea level rise piece. Anyway, that project moved into a larger investigation I did while teaching at Tulane. This is one of my last years there. We started looking at, okay, what is this region? How do you define it? This is when we started getting into towns and how individual towns collectively become real urban centers, right? So this is the statistical area of a grouping of communities along Bayou Teche, not Bayou Teche, sorry, Lafourche. And you get these different, we catalog, like, these are what the towns look like. This is how they define land. There was a whole series of surveys of, like, how do you legally define the landscape in this case? So whether it's oil rights or even oyster leases, what does mapping look like in this case? What are roadways? What does infrastructure look like? It's not just roads, it's waterways and so forth. And then what were the sort of physical elements of this area, and what did they mean, what did they represent, and technologies and ways of addressing how you live, but then also looking more critically at the area and where we're drawing roads. There were actually a whole series of other networks that you had to recognize and would begin to the more you looked. And in this case, you had helicopter byways where you had airports or heliports, where you had, tens of thousands of workers coming in from different regions that would park, short term. I love this sign. Short term parking is 1 to 2 days for them, not 1 to 2 hours, where they would go out to rig and then come back essentially. And you'd see plates from all around the region where they came in, what those populations meant. But then what, in terms of population centers, looking at offshore population statistics, and, whole cities that exist out in the water essentially. And then, through things, talking to mayors who say they need hotels, not houses, and the idea that, heliports were the networks along with the pipelines, all of that sort of fed into a way of thinking about what development meant there, what it meant to live there, and like what were not the architectural consequences of that. We weren't trying to propose a project, but we were trying to propose ways of rethinking that particular environment. And so we came up with these mantras, or these dictums, if you will. It's like corporate logic governs, not the government. Transience fuels the economy. So the more you had the more that there was land loss, the more they had to spend on, fixing things essentially. The idea that, you could create systems that didn't care about land and water. And then here again, degradation drives investment. And then acknowledging that monumental land loss is inevitable, which I think at the time, and we continue to believe that that's not going to happen. And then ultimately, more optimistically, people in nature will adapt, right? So these were all things that we were sort of like thinking about and trying to, as a way to kind of position ourselves in a thinking around that area. That early project, again, as an introduction to New Orleans, stewed for a while, and it has now sort of come back up in work that we're doing in Clarksdale, Mississippi. I'm going to show Clarksdale and probably call it after that. Basically, there's a few projects that go along with this one, but I think in general, what I would say, as an office, and in the spirit of the kind of work that we do, we invest in things and places and locations, and in this case, we've spent a lot of time in this particular community working on a series of projects for Clarksdale. Clarksdale is just south of Memphis. As I said, I lived there for Memphis for a number of years. It's another small town, around 14,000 people, depopulating a part of the larger Delta region. And then this is the town itself. This is what it looks like aerial. It has a little river that runs through it. This is it today, essentially. But it's, getting back to the idea that there's something here, there's something that motivates us, there's something that feels like it can be thought through, and that we can contribute to a way of thinking around. But these are the kind of environments that we're talking about, right? This sort of rundown Main Street, the vacated buildings in a lot of places, but still, rich texture. They have a history that really doesn't, drive what they do today. In this case, the railroad's been abandoned. These are just stored cars now. But they have a cultural lineage, Clarksdale in particular, with the blues. This was the birthplace of the blues. If you're at all familiar with the music, this is where it all began. Essentially, this is where their crossroads are. And as a consequence, people come from around the world to see this place. So its economy now, although still agricultural based, is really influenced by tourism. So you see a lot of tourism that are coming to the old juke joint. But even at that, you see abandonment. So the Krogers that have moved out. But it is a beautiful place, as we often say. This is the river that runs through the center of town, essentially, and this is one of the environments that we're working on. So to run through quickly, one of the projects that we recently completed there was the Clarksdale Collegiate Charter School, CCPCS. It ties into, again, a kind of larger idea around adaptive reuse. The idea the sort of grounding situation here with this project was you had a church that was shrinking, and its congregation was beginning to the congregation was shrinking drastically, and so they were looking for some way to sort of get out. The school was growing and was looking for this CCPCS was growing and was looking for a home. They ended up taking over the church building. This is what you see here, there, and we're showing some what we're calling collaborative reuse. We were actually, through this development, able to relocate the remaining constituents at the church to another church. So we sort of two churches mended together, and then the school had a new home. This was the church. It was a beautiful, what we thought a beautiful old kind of mid-century-ish church. The school had used a number of its classrooms as it grew from kindergarten. It is a new school, and so every year it adds another grade, essentially. And so it had kind of grown into the building over time. And then it became time for them to actually expand and created basically a compound or another building. And so what we were asked to do, although we were part of the discussion from when they first moved in, we did code review for the old church to make sure it would work for a kindergarten and first grade class. And so they asked us whenever they were ready to expand to come in and be the architects for that. So what we ended up doing was just looking at how you again, kind of embrace that church, but at the same time re-identify it with its new purpose and role as a school. And so the idea of us adding this addition that corralled the existing building, and as you'll see, sort of formally played off of that, but importantly, sort of spatially played off of and created new conditions between that old and new. This is the entry. This is one of the outdoor this is part of that entry area, and you can see the existing building to the right, and then the new structure that we created. And this is one of the outdoor corridors that I'll talk about. This was the development. It's a K-8 school. It became a K-6 school. Actually, they eliminated the 2 grades and are going to move them to another site. At around 50,000 square feet. The original building was around 20, and we added close to 30 with the addition, so kind of doubled the scale of that. And through that, you can see in plan what it looks like. Here again, like we were working through a form that tried to embrace and respect and was in many ways deferential to that existing building, and the context that it's around is all residential. You can see with the big, sloped roof forms and the shingled roof. But through the composition organization of the main, those forms were driven also by the composition and arrangement of some of the primary program pieces. And then with that as well, how everything kind of stitched together was a sort of play on an internal organization that already existed that we sort of expanded. So the series of outdoor courtyards and walkways, you can see here with a form that dips down, and you can allow the building in the back to kind of peek through. This is what this diagram is. You can actually see those ridges line up. So the valley and the ridge actually line up. You managed to make that work. The original library. And then this is that courtyard condition that I talked about. So we weren't just working with a form, we were also working through the relationship of the old and the new. So this series of columns created these cloister spaces that created courtyards. The patterning of the columns were the same patterning as the pilasters on the original building. They were brick, we were wood. So there was this sort of interplay between the two, creating these spaces. You can see here it was a walkway. And then even materially, when you didn't have brick as a counterpart, we changed from wood to steel. So there's this sort of subtle play in materiality that was also in reference to the building that was around us. And again, to sort of create these courtyards, but importantly to create this kind of circulation space where people didn't go to their classroom and you didn't see them again. There's a whole sort of orchestration of activities throughout the day where you saw students moving around and people kind of circulating in a protected way, but through the entire compound. This was, again, the old and the new. And then how that kind of rhythming and patterning sort of brought itself into the existing building itself, and then up and through the building. I'm going to stop with that and then let travelers sort of sit for another day in another one. But I have an outro here that I'd like to read through again, just to sort of say succinctly something about the work and what we went through. So I want to end with a final observation about things we do, as subjective as they may be. Namely, there's a consistency in our desire to frame our work around larger concerns, that the real effort here is not just speculating on them through the project itself, rather in the way we have or continue to work towards creating a platform that enables this engagement. It accumulates, so the office, our practice, right? It accumulates knowledge, expertise, and experience. It's burdened by that. Risks become known and tangible and liberated because you can see your working world as a realm of possibilities and not limitations. That platform, the practice, in turn, strives to be more experimental and is determined to expand the potentials we believe to be inherent in architecture. Thank you.